Commercial breaks are over. Lorwyn Eclipsed is finally here, and we have an absurd amount of cards to talk about today, which means we should probably break them down. Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for our first edition of Lorwyn Eclipsed spoilers, and today is the day. I have been counting down the days until January 5th, 2026 for months now, because it is time for Lorwyn Eclipsed spoilers, and out of all the sets coming up in 2026, this is a set that I am personally most excited for. I love Lorwyn. It's an in-universe set, the early spoilers look good, and I gotta say, the stuff we got today has me convinced that this set is going to be absolutely amazing. It is exactly what I was hoping it would be, but we have about a million cards to talk about today. It is going to be a big spoiler day, so we had better jump right into it, start talking sweet new Lorwyn Eclipsed cards. Before we do, a couple of quick reminders. First, if you need any of these cards, you can snag them from our sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/mtggoldfish. Second, to keep up on all the latest previews throughout the day, you should head on over to mtgpreviews.com. Anyway, let's talk some Lorwyn Eclipsed. First up today, we get the return of everyone's favorite sultry planeswalker in Oko with a double-sided Oko Lorwyn Legion, Oko Shadowmoor Scion. So the front side of Oko, a 3-3 loyalty blue planeswalker. +2, up to 1 target creature gains all creature types, period. Not until end of turn, all creature types forever, can be your creature or your opponent's creature. +1, target creature gets -2, -0 until your next turn. So a little bit of defense. And then on the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, you pay a Galarian and flip it into the backside, Oko Shadowmoor Scion. So the backside, -1, mill 3 cards, you can put a permanent card from among them into your hand. -3, create 2 3/3 green elk creature tokens, one being Oko without some elking. And then -6, choose a creature type. You get an emblem with creatures you control the chosen type, get +3/+3, and have vigilance and hexproof. And then at the beginning of pre-combat main phase, you can pay a blue to flip back into the front side. And I gotta say, this is a really interesting, weird, unique planeswalker. If we think about the front side of this card, there's not really great comparisons. The +2 turns a creature into all creature types, which there's some like old Lorwyn cards like Wings of Velasvale that do this for a turn, but there's nothing that we have that is just like a target creature becomes all creature types forever. Actually, in some ways I kind of hate that ability because there's no tracking for it. You're not giving a changeling counter. I think I would have preferred it if it was like, give the creature a changeling's counter. So it's gonna get weird if you just like activate Oko a whole bunch of times. Who's gonna know what's what creature type, what's all creature types? But it is an interesting effect. And then the last mode, the +1 mode, is kind of like a weird Dovinvon. It's a little bit of defense. If you can get this down early enough, it should be able to fizzle an attack, maybe buy you the time to flip into the backside. And the backside actually is relatively strong. Like the -1 generates some card advantage, you do some mill and you fill the graveyard, you get a permanent. The -3 I think is the big payoff. It calls back to old Oko with the elk tokens, but making 2 3/3 elks, that's actually a lot of value out of your planeswalker. And then the -6, it's kind of like the Vivian Reed emblem where it only works for 1 creature type, so it's going to be a little better in a tribal deck of some kind or a kindred deck of some time. But +3/+3 vigilance and hexproof means that your board is going to be really difficult for your opponent to beat without having like straight up Wrath in their deck, because your creatures are huge and they're going to be hard to interact with. So I think with Oko, the most explosive thing you can do with this card, and I'm not sure if this is really going to be good enough or not, but you try to get it down early and super quickly flip it. So you play it one turn, you +2 up to 5 loyalty, then the next turn you flip it and just immediately -3 and make 2 3/3 green elk creature tokens. And you could be doing this, maybe by like turn 3-ish in standard. If you go turn 1 Land and War, turn 2 Oko, turn 3 flip Oko, you could do that on turn 3, and that's a lot of power and toughness on the battlefield. So I think that's what you're working towards most of the time. The other option is you play it, you try to leave it on the front side, get up to 6, and then you flip it and you ultimate it to make your team huge. That's going to be even better if you're in some sort of tribal deck. Exactly where we're doing this in standard, I'm not sure. I guess maybe the Simic Badgermole Cub deck. Like, you're already playing Land and War Elves in that deck, so you can get this down as early as turn 2, and then you have Badgermole Cub for even more explosive mana. The elf tokens benefit from like a Boroid, so maybe you play it there. I don't know if it's going to be like optimal. We'll have to wait and see, but that's the first thing thing I thought of is maybe playing the Simic Badger Mole Cub style deck. The card is really good with Llanowar, like just coming down on turn 2 increases the odds that the +1 is going to protect Oko enough for you to flip it the next turn. And once you flip it, the backside is pretty good, although it is weird that the backside doesn't gain loyalty. So you're going to really want to be flipping this back and forth, assuming you have a long-term game plan with this card, to like keep it on the front side to gain loyalty, then flip it to the backside to be able to spend that loyalty. So it is just a super uniquely designed Planeswalker. I'm not sure it's like the most powerful Planeswalker ever, which I think there might be a little bit of an Oko tax because the first Oko was such a historically broken card. I feel like Wizards tends to play it like a little bit safer with Oko, but I gotta say, this is one of the more interesting Planeswalker designs that we've gotten in a long time. I don't know if it's going to be one of the most powerful Planeswalkers we've gotten in a long time, but just as far as how interesting the card is, this is really high on the list. So what else can you do with this card? And I know some people are probably going to focus in on like giving a creature all creature types and be like, ooh, now I can play Thalia in my Merfolk deck, and I can use Oko to turn Thalia into a Merfolk, so it benefits from Lord of Atlantis. I don't think that's what you want to be doing with this card, especially in 60 card formats. It's just such a risky plan to try to rely on a single card like Oko to like make your creature types work, although the card does seem really sweet in tribal commander decks. I know Tomer has his tribal deck where it's like Ur-Dragon and a whole bunch of changelings, and you just play all the random lords, and being able to take and like turn your Mirror Galvanizer or your Captivating Vampire, these lords that you're playing, to benefit your changelings into all creature types, essentially making them into a changeling, is actually very strong, because then they benefit from your Ur-Dragons, and they power up your Ur-Dragons, and they benefit from your other lords. So I think this is a Planeswalker that, just because of that +2 ability, it doesn't look very threatening. So I imagine you can like play Oko +2 it a few times to like power up your weird synergies, and probably get away with that without anyone killing it. So I think it might actually be a Planeswalker that's good enough to play in Commander, at least in the right deck. So Oko Lorwyn Liege, Oko Shadowmoor Scion. This card intrigues me. I think that's the best way to play it. I'm not sure if it's going to be good or not, but the card's really interesting, and it's one of those cards that's just got me thinking about how can I brew a deck around this? Is this going to be good enough? I think, as I mentioned before, baseline, play it, try to make sure to get up to enough loyalty that you can flip it and make those elks, and maybe that's going to be good enough on its own. Otherwise, there's just so many weird synergies, because this card has just such unique abilities. We also got a new white mythic in Curious Colossus. So Curious Colossus, it's a 7-mana 7/7 giant warrior. It says when this creature enters, each creature target opponent controls loses all abilities, becomes a coward in addition to its other types, and has base power and toughness of 1/1. So Curious Colossus, it kind of calls back to humility a little bit, overwhelming splendor even more specifically, since it only kind of wrecks one person. There is a twist here though. Overwhelming splendor, humility, they sit out on the battlefield and have a static effect. Curious Colossus is only going to humility or overwhelming splendor whatever creature's target opponent has on the battlefield when it resolves. I guess you could start blinking it and really making everyone at the table mad, but I think this card is essentially just, you really hose one person in a game of Commander. As far as standard's concerned, yes, you can make a Boroid or Badger Cub or Grand lose all their abilities and be 1/1s. It's 7 mana though. I just can't imagine in standard realistically having enough mana to cast this before I die to those decks. Plus, it only turns the creatures into base power and toughness of 1/1. So if there's already a bunch of counters on things from a Boroid or whatever, Earthbend lands, those are still going to be relatively big creatures. So I don't think this was really designed to be a standard card. I hope it is. It's probably going to be a funny against odds deck. Like, if you can just play this and blink it every turn, you kind of built your own super janky humility that's legal in standard. So I'm excited to brew around it, but I would be shocked if this was a competitive card. In Commander, I think you probably play this in giant decks would be the most obvious home, like Calamine or Storvald. The problem with this card is it's really just going to make one person super mad. Like, you're going to have to choose one person. All of their creatures suddenly become useless 1/1 cowards, and they're probably going to be your enemy for the rest of the game. So if you play this card, I think you either want to be blinking it a bunch of times or targeting the arch enemy with it, because they probably deserve to, have all their creatures become cowards. But there's going to be situations where you play it and you just have to choose someone to wreck, and it might actually be a bit of a negative because you're going to make an enemy at the table, and I'm not sure this card is strong enough to back up the heat. Like, it's only kind of a vanilla 7/7 once it enters. So the design is super cool. Sweet against the odds card for Standard. Love the callback to Humility and Overwhelming Splendor, and mostly a way to just rile up one person in a Commander game. We also got, this card. I love the art on this card in Vibrance with the Flower Dog, and it's just such a sweet, very Lorwyn-y piece of art. And this is one of the members of the Elemental Evoke cycle that we get in Mythic, and I think this is a pretty good one. So it's a 5 mana, including 2 Gruul hybrid mana 4/4. It says when it enters, if double red was spent on it, it deals 3 damage to each creature. When it enters, if double green was spent on it, you can search your library for a land card, not even a basic land, any land card, put it in your hand and then shuffle, and you gain 2 life, and you can evoke it for the hybrid Gruul mana. So essentially for 2 mana, you can do the Lightning Bolt thing, or you can do the Sylvan Scrying thing, and I think that's actually a pretty good baseline. For me, the Lightning Bolt mode keeps it relevant in basically any situation. The Sylvan Scrying mode, I think, is the highest upside mode. If you're playing like a Tron deck, or a Lotus Field combo deck, or a Dark Depths Thespian Stage combo deck, you might already be playing Sylvan Scrying to try to be able to set up your land-based combo, and this just seems like Sylvan Scrying plus. Like, you get the Sylvan Scrying effect, plus you get to gain some life, plus you might be able to Lightning Bolt, and then once you get up to 5 mana, you can actually cast this as a 4/4, maybe even get both abilities. So I think there's certainly homes for this. The only downside compared to Sylvan Scrying is it is double green instead of single green, so if you're playing like Tron and you have a bunch of colorless lands, that could be a bit of an issue. But if you're in the market for a Sylvan Scrying effect, this is Sylvan Scrying with a massive amount of upside. As far as Standard's concerned, that mode's actually kind of the weakest mode, because we just don't have any crazy lands to tutor up. It's not like we can assemble Merit Lage or build Tron in Standard. However, getting a Bossing, say, or in the right matchup, a Cavern of Souls, even in like a landfall deck, a fetch land, like a Fabled Passage for double landfall triggers, seems fine. But I think the really big selling point for this card in Standard is actually going to be the red mode. In the red mode, it is a 2 mana sorcery speed Lightning Bolt, so it's not like super exciting. The exciting part of it is it comes attached to this pretty decent body that you can cast in maybe at both modes later in the game. But for 2 mana, this does deal with pretty much all the early game threats in Standard. Like anything that's 1 or 2 mana, this should be able to take down. So if your opponent plays a Badger Mole Cub or a Deep Cavern Bat or a Hired Claw, this is a good enough removal spell. And then eventually you get to 5, which isn't a huge amount of mana, and hopefully get both modes out of it, and then it's very good. The other thing worth mentioning about this card is, and I guess this is true of all these Evoke cards, is it does tend to work well with things that care about high mana value stuff, because technically this is a 5-drop, even though you can evoke it for 2 mana. So Up the Beanstalk banned in most places, but that's the kind of synergy you're looking for. If you get an Up the Beanstalk in your Commander deck, this gets even better. Or in Commander, Eshik Teemer's Roar specifically cares about creatures with power 4 or greater. So this is something that kind of works there. You can cast a 4-power creature, but evoke it for just 2 mana to trigger your stuff. So those are the other synergies to think about with this card. But I actually think that Vibrance might be one of the better members of the cycle that we've seen so far. I think baseline, being a Sylvan Scrying that's a little bit trickier to cast, but with a huge amount of upside, is probably enough for this to see play in certain archetypes that are trying to assemble land combos. And then in Standard, I think it's just like a fine removal spell / value creature. So it just seems like good value all around, and that art is just so good. It's so good. Next up, we get some S tier pun action with Meek Attack. A 3 mana red enchantment that says you can pay 1 and a red to put a creature card with total power and toughness of 5 or less from your hand onto the battlefield. It gains haste. At the beginning of the next end step, you gotta sacrifice the creature. Also worth mentioning, as you can see, all the way on the right, we're getting Fractured Foils back in the set, which Wizards, thank you for adding Fractured Foils for this set. I feel like something like Fractured Foils, like a next tier of foiling, has been missing from a lot of recent sets, and it's made opening those sets a little bit rough, especially collector boosters from a value perspective. So I'm glad that we're getting these super high-end, Japanese treatment Fractured Foils, which are going to be worth a ton of money, because it's going to make opening the boxes a little bit better. But Meek Attack itself, this is a callback to infamous red enchantment, Sneak Attack. The difference is, Meek Attack, as its name kind of suggests, only puts little creatures into play. So it's not going to do what Sneak Attack does, which, if you've ever played against Sneak Attack, if someone drops a Sneak Attack, they're probably putting an Eldrazi into play, an Emrakul into play, and annihilating you, and a Trox into play, drawing a new handful of cards, trying to win the game. Meek Attack, because of the total power and toughness of 5 or less restriction, isn't going to be able to do that. So what do we do with this card? And the answer is, I think this is like a weird, cheaper, standard legal sneak attack, but the things you have to play with it to turn it into a sneak attack are also kind of weird. So like in standard, for example, it's really good with Threefold Thunderhulk, a card that we've played in a few different decks, and it always tends to perform better than you think it would. But it's a 7-drop that enters with 3+1/+1 counters on it, and then when it enters or attacks, you create a number of 1/1s equal to its power, and then you can sacrifice artifacts to grow it, but technically it's a 0/0. So it's a 0/0 as far as Meek Attack's concerned, but actually it's going to come into play with 3 counters, so it's kind of a 3/3, and then it's also going to make a bunch of 1/1s, or Famished Worldsire, for example, an 8-mana 0/0, with Devour Land 3. So every land that you eat, you're going to get 3 counters on it, and then you get to put a bunch of lands into play with this enters triggers. Prime Speaker Zagana, technically a 1/1, but when it enters, gets a bunch of counters based on the greatest power among creatures you control. So these are the kind of cards you're looking for, and I can imagine in standard, like, if you can get this down on turn 2 or on turn 3, and then just the next turn put a Threefold Thunderhulk into play, that actually might be enough to win a lot of games. Once you get back to older formats, you get even more sweet options. Agent of Treachery happens to be 5 total power and toughness, so you can just Meek Attack this into play, start stealing your opponent's land, stealing their best permanents. You can put a Master of Cruelties into play, maybe one-shot kill your opponent by surprise. There's cards like Trystani Summoner, Maul Splicer, that actually add a huge amount of power to the battlefield. Like Trystani Summoner, a 7-mana 1/1, but it makes a 2/2, a 3/3, and a 4/4 trampling token when it enters, so you're actually getting 10 power and toughness out of it. That's also something you put into play with Meek Attack. So I just love that this is a card that makes you look for finishers that you wouldn't normally play. The video's gonna be coming up. I actually was recently playing a pre-modern Reanimator deck, and one of the things it made me think about is how Reanimator used to be such a cool archetype, because the things that you want to reanimate actually changed and varied depending on the matchup, depending on the metagame. You had to choose, do I want to Inkwell Leviathan, or do I want an Iona? Like, you had to actually think about it. But then they started putting these like super over the top, and I'm not talking about like recently, I'm talking like 15 years ago. I think it started with like Grizzlebrand was the first one, where it just became always the best thing to do to put Grizzlebrand into play. And then later we got Archon of Cruelty and Atraxa, which actually ended up being even better Grizzlebrand. But eventually Reanimator ended up being, you always knew what you wanted to put into play. It didn't really matter the meta, it didn't really matter the matchup. You just always wanted to put Atraxa or Grizzlebrand or Archon into play. So there was no thought, there was no choices here. And I love that Meek Attack is making me think about this. If it was Sneak Attack, it would be boring. You just look for the biggest, most game-ending creature possible, and you always know that that's the best thing to put into play. But with Meek Attack, we're actually searching through Scryfall, searching through Gatherer, trying to find Trystani Summoners and Master of Cruelties that might be good to put into play with this card, and I think that is a sign of a really good design. Obviously not as strong as Sneak Attack itself, but as far as just brewing and how interesting it is, and for puns, I think it is actually a better card. You can also just like put a Scornful Egotist into play. I'm just saying, if you want to put a Scornful Egotist into play by surprise, even at instant speed, Meek Attack gets the job done. One thing I did want to mention, because I knew this would get some people, cards that are like Lumra, which has power and toughness equal to the number of lands you control. In general, these cards are going to have that power and toughness in every zone. So in your hand, if you have 7 lands on the battlefield, Lumra's going to be a 7/7. You're not going to be able to put it into play with Meek Attack. So it's not going to work with most of the star creatures or things that reset their power and toughness based on things. So keep that in mind as you're looking for things to brew with. Because a card like Lumra, at first glance, you'd be like, oh, that's really sweet. I cheat it into play. I mill, I get a bunch of lands into play. But it actually doesn't work. I guess it works if you have like 2 lands in play somehow, but it doesn't normally work. As far as other things you could do with this card, you could use this as a way to set up combos, like you can Sneak Attack Village Bellringers and then Kiki Jiki into play, set up the infinite combo there. Why would you want to do this as opposed to just casting them? Well, partly it's cheaper, and partly it does get around counter spells, which is one of the upsides of a card like Meek Attack. Once you get it on the battlefield, it can cheat creatures into play, even if your opponent has a counter spell in hand. So Meek Attack, I love this card. The design is awesome. The flavor is awesome. The callback is awesome. The pun is awesome. And it's a really interesting card to brew around. So well done all around on this one, Wizards. We also got Chronicle of Victory, a new 6-mana mythic legendary artifact. It says when it enters, you choose a creature type. Creatures you control the chosen type, get +2/+2, have first strike and trample, and then whenever you cast a spell of the chosen type, you draw a card. So Chronicle of Victory, it's literally a Vanquisher's Banner for +1 mana, but you get a little better buff out of it. Vanquisher's Banner just gave the creatures of the type +1/+1. This gives +2/+2, first strike and trample, so it's kind of like an overcome, almost an overrun, sitting on the battlefield, and the trample is huge there. That is a really, really big upgrade. So this is a card that's basically the same as Vanquisher's Banner. If you're going to play Vanquisher's Banner, you can now play this card. If you're going to consider this card, you're definitely going to be some sort of tribal style deck. As far as Standard's concerned, in theory, you can play it in any tribal deck you want to. You can play it in Elves, you can play it in Mice, you can play it in, I don't know, Mutable Explorer. I guess it could be any creature type. So there are ways that you could play it, but I think at 6 mana, it's just really too much for Standard. I would be very surprised if it was fast enough. Like, Standard games just end on like turn 4 a lot of the time, or like someone has gained control by turn 4. So it's hard for me to imagine spending 6 mana for a card that's not going to do anything for a turn, and that card actually needs to like stick on the battlefield. And you could do this if you're like a ramp deck, right? Maybe, or some sort of, we've seen some planetarium decks, just meme planetariums of Washington decks, which is another 6 mana artifact. But this has to go into a tribal deck. So I don't know how your Mouse deck, for example, is ever going to get this on the battlefield. So I think this was mostly designed to be a commander card, but I think this is a really good commander card. Like, pretty much any tribal commander deck, be it Giada Angels, or Sidar Jabari Knights, or the First Sliver Slivers, or Lathril Elves, or Marinara Rats, this card's at least in the conversation, because it does everything that Vanquisher's Banner does for just 1 more mana, but it also works like a finisher thanks to trample, actually letting you kill your opponents. Vanquisher's Banner really good at like dirtling and generating value. This does the same dirtling value generating thing, but also lets you eventually win the game. So Chronicle of Victory, probably not made for Standard, but it really is a good commander card. We also got a big green giant druid mythic, an Aurora Awakener. So Aurora Awakener, a 7 mana 7/7. It has trample, and it has vivid, which is a new mechanic. And vivid means it does something based on the number of colors of permanents you control. So if you only have 1 color, it's going to be 1, all the way up to 5 if you have all 5 colors. So vivid, when this creature enters, reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal X permanent cards, where X is the number of colors among permanents you control. Put any number of those permanent cards on the battlefield, then put the rest of the reveal cards on the bottom of your library in a random order. So Aurora Awakener, when I first read this card, I thought this card might actually be kind of good. I gotta say, I'm a little skeptical of the vivid mechanic. Like, needing to get a whole bunch of different colors of permanents on the battlefield seems like kind of a big ask. It reminds me a little bit of Converge, which was similar from Battle for Zendikar. Well, that set. Talking about flop sets from a decade ago. Battle for Zendikar was pretty high on the flop list, but it kind of reminds me of Converge, which didn't end up being a super great mechanic. I actually think Woodland Wanderer might have been one of the most played cards with that mechanic. So just needing to get so many different colors of permanents on the battlefield is not only difficult, but it also means that you really need to be 3, 4, or 5 colors to really consider these cards, because something like Aurora Awakener, if you're just vividing 1 in mono green, is really not going to be worth it. On the other end, if you're vividing 5, then maybe we're talking here. It does seem sweet with Niv Mizzet Guild Pack, like the Forgotten Niv Mizzet that still exists in Standard, which also cares about getting multicolor permanents on the battlefield. Multicolor permanents, a good way to just up your color count, so maybe we can build some sort of like Niv Mizzet Aurora Awakener deck, which would be kind of sweet. As far as comparisons, when I first saw this card, I was like, ooh, this is almost like an Apex Devastator. If I can just get all the colors on the battlefield, and then I cast this, I'm going to put 5 permanents into play. That's actually kind of ridiculous. Also kind of remind me of like a powered up Genesis Hydra. But then I read the card again and I realized this can just hit lands. It doesn't say non-land permanent cards. So you can do all this work and get up to 7 mana and cast this card, and because almost half your deck is going to be lands, those permanents you hit, a good chunk of them are most likely just going to be lands, which is actually kind of disappointing. This isn't going to be like an Italy that you're guaranteed to spin into non-lands and be able to play big things. So when you think about the fact that this can hit lands, it actually makes me way less excited for this card, and now I kind of think this card is actually probably pretty bad. It is cool if you can start blinking it. Maybe there's a world where the lands are an upside and you're actually using this as a weird late game ramp spell where you're like Aurora Awakener, hit some lands, use those lands to like ephemerate or something to blink it, get more triggers, put more lands into play, and eventually use those lands to win the game somehow. So maybe that's what you're supposed to do with this card. I will say the getting more hybrid cards does help, just like we talked about with Niv Mizzet. Like having hybrid cards, it's one card that's 2 colors for sure. So it's another way you can just kind of up your vivid count to make sure you're getting as many shots with Aurora Awakener as possible. But as far as standard's concerned, it's hard for me to imagine why you wouldn't just cast a Vaultborn Tyrant or something that's just guaranteed value, guaranteed life, guaranteed cards, some resilience to removal, rather than trying to like hope you spin into non-lands with Aurora Awakener. The one place this card does seem sweet though is in 5 colors Matter Commander decks. So if you're playing like the Prismatic Bridge or Jared Carthalion or Jensen Carthalion Druid Exiles your commander, then this card's pretty good. Like if you can consistently have 5 colors of permanence on the battlefield, even knowing that if you spin 5 with this, odds are 2 or 3 of your 5 is going to end up being lands. That's still not bad for 7 mana. So it seems like a good 5-color card. And this card is still kind of interesting to build around. I'm still intrigued by it. But I think the fact that you're going to end up putting a lot of lands into play, and that it's 7 mana, and that it asks you to put a whole bunch of colors on the battlefield, probably means this card isn't super competitive. We also got easily my favorite card that they spoiled today. Not even close. And this card is probably horrible, but it does such cool things in Mirrorform. So Mirrorform, a 6-mana instant. It says each non-land permanent you control becomes a copy of target non-aura permanent. So this calls back to Mirrorweave, going back to Shadowmoor, original Innistrad block, which let you choose a creature and then turn all your creatures into a copy of that creature's until end of turn. Mirrorform is that, but like supercharged. Not only does it work with all your non-land permanents, it can turn all your non-land permanents into a copy of any non-aura permanent, and that includes your opponent's permanents as well. So Mirrorform is 6 mana. I don't think this card's gonna break anything, but it just does so many unique, interesting, fun things. So first, if you want to win with Biovisionary, this is one of the easiest ways to do it. Just like Mirrorweave, you need 4 Biovisionaries on the battlefield. You get 1 down, you get any random permanents, you Mirrorform, turn everything into Biovisionaries, you win the game on your end step. Also worth mentioning, unlike Mirrorweave, which only turned things into the thing until end of turn, Mirrorform turns them into the thing forever. So keep that in mind as you're choosing with this card. But what else can we do with this card? And I think what makes me so excited about this card is the fact that it works with any non-land permanent. Getting a whole bunch of creatures on the battlefield for Mirrorweave is actually pretty hard. But if you can use map tokens and food tokens and random artifacts and random enchantments and use all those with Mirrorform, then it becomes much, much easier to do this huge, ridiculous thing. I think this might be my doppelganger of the set. I honestly do think this might be the doppelganger of the set, that we just play a whole bunch of times to do funny things and probably don't win a ton with, but just do really fun things with it. But like Spyglass Siren is 2 permanents for Mirrorform for 1 mana. Same with Spider Ham. Treasure Map can technically be 4. So it's very easy to up your permanent count. And then you just turn your stuff into whatever you want. Like, how do you actually win with this? You can have a Sephiroth out and turn all your things into Sephiroth, and they all legend rule each other, and you get a billion Sephiroth triggers and win the game. You can turn all your things into Parker Luck and just see what happens on the end step. Someone's going to get burnt out to a ton of huge Parker Luck triggers. Sylvan Scavenging, you're just going to make a ton of tokens on your end step. If you turn all your stuff into Demonic Pact, you go to your next upkeep and you just choose the 4 damage mode a million times. Or speaking of 4 damage, you turn everything into Overlord of the Boiler Biggles and attack with them and win the game that way. So once you get to the bunch of permanents on the battlefield and can cast this, there's just so many different ways you can win the game. If you just want to have fun, turn all your stuff into a doubling season and then make a token, and it's going to be billions of tokens. Turn all your things into Panharmonicons and then play a whatever, Muldrifter, and draw your entire deck. The possibilities are endless. The other thing that's crazy about this card is if you read it carefully, it says each non-land permanent you control becomes a copy of target non-aura permanent. That last mode doesn't say non-land permanent, so you can technically turn all of your non-land permanents into a land if you want to, which probably sounds not good, but if you can make a ton of random trinket tokens, maps and clues and so forth that aren't very useful, and then all of a sudden turn them all into lands, you're going to have an absurd amount of mana. If they're all Bossing Says or Restless Vinestalks, you might be able to just win by beating down with your lands, or you could probably set up some weird doppelganger style combo where you can use all those lands to do more big things. So this card is just wild. There's even more tricks than that. Like, it's an instant, so if your opponent goes to wrath your board, you could Mirrorform and turn all of your things into a Maze Mindstone, so all of your creatures are now a random artifact. Or you could turn all your stuff into Blood Artist, so the wrath resolves, but then your opponent dies to Blood Artist triggers. Or worst cases, Solemn Simulacrum or Spinner of Soul, so at least you get value from things dying. There's just so many shenanigans with this card. So Mirrorform, it's 6 mana. It's not going to break standard. It's not going to dethrone Is It Lessons or Mono Red or Dimir. But this is one of the coolest cards that Wizards has made in a long time. And I feel like I'm just scratching the surface of all the really sweet things we can do with this card. Easily one of my favorites from the set, and also just more spectacular art. The art in this set is so good. We also got a reprint mythic in Bloom Tender. So Bloom Tender, you probably know this one, kind of a commander staple. It's a 2-mana 1/1. It now has Vivid because it taps to make a mana for each color among permanents you control. It's an elf druid, and this card is relevant mostly for financial purposes. This was one of the most expensive cards from original Lorwyn block. It's like $25 or something because of commander play, and I think it's just a good reprint value-wise. I'm glad more of these exist. As far as seeing play in standard, I would be surprised. Like, we live in Badger Mole Cub world. I don't think Bloom Tender is actually going to cut it. We had Faber Welder, which is kind of a more expensive but bigger version of Bloom Tender a few years ago in Throne of Eldraine. It didn't really make it in standard. So I think this is mostly like a harmless reprint for standard, as far as I just can't imagine that Bloom Tender is going to be better than Badger Mole Cub or even really see that much play at all. But it is a $25 card that's going to help bring the cost of the game down a little bit for people playing Commander, at least. Of course, since we're heading back to Lorwyn, we also have a bunch of tribal stuff, as we see with half of the champion cycle. So this cycle is pretty interesting. We can see it on Champions of the Perfect, a 4-mana 6/6 elf warrior. This has is an additional cost to cast the spell. You need to behold an elf and exile it. So you need to exile an elf that you control, or an elf card from your hand. And then it says, whenever you cast a creature spell, you draw a card, and when it leaves the battlefield, you return the exiled card to its owner's hand. So you're getting a above the curve creature, a 6/6 for 4 that also draws you a ton of cards. But the downside is you need to exile an elf from your battlefield or from your hand. In this mechanic, it calls back to the actual champion mechanic from original Lorwyn, and this is basically a fixed version of that mechanic. The original mechanic would let you cast the creature, but then you'd have to exile a creature of the same type from the battlefield, and if you didn't, you'd have to sacrifice the thing that you just cast, and that meant that you would cast the thing, and if your opponent killed your creature in response, you would have to sacrifice the thing you just cast, and you'd lose the thing on the battlefield. So it had some feel-bads brought in, and it's 2026, we don't do feel-bads in Magic anymore. So this is essentially the 2026 it can't really go too wrong for you version of the champion mechanic from original Lorwyn. But I think these cards are potentially still very powerful, but you need to be able to exile the thing of the right creature type. So Champions of the Perfect, you're pretty much only going to play in an elf deck. Champion of the Clachan, you're only going to play in a Kithkin deck. Champion of the Weird, you're only going to play in a Goblin deck. There is one exception though, which is Changelings do help fill the gaps, and we are getting a bunch of new Changelings in the set. Flock Imposter, Sizzling Changeling, Chomping Changeling, and many, many more. So especially in Limited, these cards are probably going to be a little better than they look, because you can always just exile one of these Changelings, no matter which of the champions that you're playing. But as far as these cards in specific, Champion of the Perfect, we already read this one. 4-mana 6/6, you gotta behold and exile an elf. When you cast a creature spell, you draw a card. This is essentially Beast Whisperer, already a very playable card in elves, but you get a 6/6 instead of a 2/3, and the cost is you have to exile an elf from somewhere to play it. So if you are playing Beast Whisperer, I think you play this instead, and this is actually also very good alongside Beast Whisperer in Commander, because you want redundancy on this effect. And if you're playing an elf deck, there's a good chance that you're going to have a random elf in your hand that you can exile, or definitely one on the battlefield that you can exile to get this on the battlefield, because elves are just so good at spewing elves into play. So I think this is going to be a pretty easy one to get on the battlefield. We do have some pieces for this in Standard, although honestly in Standard, I just don't know if the meta is in a place where elves are going to be good. Like, Llanowar into Elvish Archdruid, into Champions of the Perfect, try to chain together some elves. Like, it does seem sweet, and I'm going to try to build elves in Standard. I'm just not sure they're as explosive as something like Badger Molekup, so it might be the worst version of the green ramp deck, as crazy as that sounds, because elves is traditionally the best green ramp deck. But I do think this is very good in elves. Whether or not elves make it in Standard, that's another question altogether. In Commander, you play this in every elf deck. Like, it's so good in elf decks in Commander. You get a big body, you get the card draw effect, and there's really not much downside. So if you're Lathril or Voja or Marwyn, doesn't matter, put Champions of Perfect in your deck. It's going to be very, very good. We also got Champion of the Clachan, the Kithkin Champion, a 4-mana 4/5 Kithkin Knight with Flash. As an additional cost, you got to behold and exile a Kithkin. Other Kithkin get +1/+1, so a 4-mana 4/5 Flash Lord. And then, of course, when it leaves the battlefield, you get your card back. So the problem with Champion of the Clachan is it only works with Kithkin. Like, it's not a bad card, and it's riding a bear, which is actually pretty sweet. But it's essentially like a Wizened Sen for 4 mana with a much bigger body, and you get Flash. I'm just skeptical that Kithkin exist in any format. We'll have to wait and see once we get the rest of Lorwyn. The problem with Kithkin is, unlike elves, which have a lot of support from foundations and other sets, Kithkin don't really have much support outside of original Lorwyn, so it's not like there's a bunch of good Kithkin floating around in Standard. So if Kithkin are going to be a deck, it's going to be because Lorwyn Eclipsed was good enough almost by itself to make them a deck. So if Kithkin are a deck, I think Champion of the Clachan, especially being instant speed, so you can get some blowouts during combat where your opponent's blocks thinks they got some good blocks going, and then you flash this in to pump your team and make the box bland and maybe kill a bunch of your opponent's creatures. It actually does seem good. I just don't know if Kithkin are going to be good enough to see play. So TBD on this one until we see more of Lorwyn Eclipse. We also got Champion of the Weird, which I think this card is actually kind of busted, but the Beholding a Goblin is actually kind of a big drawback on this one. So Champion of the Weird, a 4-mana 5/5 Goblin Berserker. You got to behold and exile a goblin. It says pay 1 life to blight 2, and then target opponent blights 2, activate only as a sorcery. So what is blighting? Blighting means you have to put 2 -1/-1 counters on one of your creatures. In this case, when you blight 2, you also force your opponent to blight 2, so they're going to have to put 2 -1/-1 counters on one of their creatures. So that's the idea of this card. And then, of course, when it dies, you get back whatever you beheld. So Champion of the Weird. The good news is, we have lots of good goblins in Standard. Howl Squad Heavy, Seer Slicer Goblin, Krenko Mob Boss, our boy Fleam, but we have a ton of goblins in Standard, so that's the good news. The bad news is, I don't really see what Champion of the Weird does with goblins. I guess, if you just play this fairly in a goblin deck, you're kind of playing it like a weird, almost symmetrical Wrath, where you're going to play this, you're going to hope you have enough toughness on the battlefield that you can activate it enough to clear away your opponent's board, but still leave your board left over, which maybe with tokens from like Krenko and so forth and Howl Squad Heavy, maybe you can actually pull that off, but I think that's the fair way to play the card. The exciting thing with this card is it gets absolutely busted when you have -1/-1 counter synergies, and there are some cards in Magic that almost combo with Champion of the Weird. Scorpion God doesn't combo with Scorpion God, but whenever a creature with a -1/-1 counter on it dies, you draw a card. This includes your creatures and your opponent's creatures, which means if you can get Champion of the Weird on the battlefield with Scorpion God and start doing the Blight mode, you're going to draw a ridiculous amount of cards. We also have Obelisk Spider. Whenever you put 1 or more -1/-1 counters on a creature, each opponent loses a life, you gain a life. Nest of Scarabs. Whenever you put 1 or more -1/-1 counters on a creature, create that many 1/1 black insect creature tokens. That means if you have a Nest of Scarabs with a Champion of the Weird, you pay 1 life, you blight 2 yourself, blight 2 your opponent, that's 4 -1/-1 counters. That means 4 insect tokens, which then means you can blight onto those insects to guarantee that you're going to be able to wrath your opponent's entire board. And if you add something like Obelisk Spider to also drain as you're putting counters on things, I think you actually just win the game. Same with Hapatra makes tokens like Obelisk Spider, Flourishing Defenses, same thing but on a 5-mana green enchantment. So these cards work so incredibly well with Champion of the Weird. Like, it's the perfect synergy piece for these cards. The problem is, I don't see any goblins here, so I'm not sure how I get Champion of the Weird actually on the battlefield if I'm playing a -1/-1 counter Scorpion God style deck, which means we're gonna have to find some way to like play a deck with Patras and Nest of Scarabs and Scorpion Gods and Obelisk Spiders, but also enough goblins to get Champion of the Weird into play. Maybe you can do this with Mutavault or Changelings or something, but the payoffs are absurd. Like, the payoffs are so incredibly good. I'm just not sure how we actually get Champion of the Weird on the battlefield. So this is one of the weirdest ones out of the whole bunch, where I think it actually has the strongest ability with the symmetrical Blight 2. There's just so much synergy there, but it's going to be one of the trickiest ones to get on the battlefield in the deck that really wants it. You can't just get on the battlefield easily in just a goblin deck or whatever, but then you don't really have that many synergies for the blighting. But if you want to get it on the battlefield in a synergistic deck for the blighting, then you're not going to have many goblins. So this card actually kind of has me perplexed. It's just such an interesting problem to solve brewing wise. We also got Harmonized Crescendo, and this one's pretty straightforward. 6-mana instant. You can convoke it so you can tap your creatures to help pay the cost. Choose a creature type, draw a card for each permanent you control of that type. Also instant speed, which is nice. So this is a more expensive instant speed Distant Melody, except you can tap your creatures to help pay for it, which I think means it's actually just better Distant Melody, and it should be better Distant Melody, considering it's a rare and Distant Melody is a 20-year-old uncommon at this point, or common at this point. But I think this is essentially just the updated version of Distant Melody. As far as standard's concerned, you gotta be a deck with a whole bunch of creatures of the same creature type, and I'm just not sure that deck exists. The two things I thought of, Deeproot Pilgrimage Merfolk can go pretty wide with Merfolk tokens, so maybe you could play it there. Heir Apparent, obviously, meme tier, but super funny with Harmonized Crescendo, because you make so many rabbits in the deck, and then you're just gonna draw like most of your deck, you tap them to Convoke, to gotta really spend mana. So those are the kind of homes that it could be good. Maybe there's a deck in Standard that can pull it off. Convoke does make it interesting. Like, the fact that you can tap your creatures to pay for it really helps. But I think where this card is an easy staple is in Tribal Commander decks. And again, it doesn't really matter what creature type you're playing around, but if you're going super wide with a creature type, because you're Wilhelm making zombies, or a Layla making fairy rogues, or Vren making rats, or First Sliver cascading into slivers, or Sajar Jabari making a bunch of knights, I think you play this as card draw in those decks pretty much every time, because often you're going to be able to cast it for close to free, and you're going to be able to draw a huge amount of cards. So Harmonized Crescendo, worst case, easy commander staple is an upgraded Distant Melody, and maybe some sneaky standard play too. We also got a Merfolk card in Deepway Navigator, a 2-mana Azorius 2/2 with flash. It says when it enters, untap each other Merfolk you control. As long as you attacked with 3 or more Merfolk this turn, Merfolk you control get +1/+0. So Deepway Navigator, I think this is a callback to Mirrormind. The untap mode is the weirdest part on this. I'm like, why is this untapping Merfolk? I don't see any synergies for this, but I think it's just supposed to be a callback to Mirrormind and Merfolk untapping themselves in original Lorwyn. And I guess you can like attack with your Merfolk and then flash this in, untap them for pseudo vigilance, or wait until your opponent attacks you when you have some tap Merfolk and flash this in, untap them, do some blocking. So I think it's little shenanigans like that, but I think it's mostly going to be a flavor callback to Mirrormind. I will say, I've seen some people being like, oh, this is the new Splinter Twin combo piece. Unless I'm missing something, I don't think this works with Splinter Twin. I think what people are thinking is it works like Village Bellringer, which untaps all creatures when it enters, but Deepway Navigator only untaps all other creatures. So they put that other on there, I assume, specifically to make it not combo with Splinter Twin. So I don't think you can go infinite, because if you put your Splinter Twin on the Deepway Navigator, you tap it once, you untap everything else, but then your Splinter Twin Navigator is still going to be tapped when Village Bellringer actually untaps all your creatures, including itself. So I don't think it's a combo piece. I think this is kind of a twist on a Lord of Atlantis. Reminds me a little bit of Voldaren Hexcatcher, because you can flash it in, and we've seen that be pretty powerful. Lord effects that you can flash in tend to mess with combat, maybe punch up a little bit, because you can make your opponent do some bad blocks or catch them by surprise with a greedy attack where they're not expecting to be able to pump your creature. So I think this is a fine Merfolk card. I don't think it's good enough for like Modern or Pioneer Merfolk, but Standard Merfolk, I don't know. We got Mindspring Merfolk, we got Sentinel in the Nameless City, we get new Sig, Flood Pit counter, I can see enough pieces to make some sort of Merfolk deck work in Standard, and if so, I think the Deepway Navigator would probably be a part of it. In Commander, I think the card is good enough to play in Merfolk Commander decks. The only problem is it's in Azorius, which kind of limits the homes for it. You pretty much got to be a Sig deck, either old Sig or new Sig, discounting whatever more Merfolk Commanders we get from Lorwyn Eclipsed itself, but most Merfolk decks are like in Mono Blue or maybe Simic, not so much in Azorius. So a good card in Commander for Merfolk, you just got to be Azorius Merfolk, which your deck may or may not be. So Deepway Navigator, it's fine. I played in a Merfolk deck, but I'm not super excited for it. We also got another one of the command cycle in Grub's command. So a 5-mana Kindred sorcery. So it's a Goblin Kindred sorcery. And if you've never played with Kindred before, that means that Grub's command, it counts as a Goblin, which has some synergies that we'll talk about in a minute. But the modes on this card, you get to choose 2 of. Create a token that's a copy of target Goblin you control. Creatures target player control get +1/+1 and gain haste until end of turn. Destroy target artifact or creature. Target player mills 5 cards, then puts each Goblin card milled this way into their hand. So Grub's command, if you look at the modes, the first mode, I don't know, you Crackling Counterpart, but only one of your Goblins, essentially. So a restricted version of Crackling Counterpart, that everything gets +1/+1 in haste mode, reminds me most of Lorehold command, another 5-mana command that we had not that long ago. Little bit of a twist, no indestructible, but you get a toughness boost instead. You get some removal like Bedevil, and then you get essentially like a better Goblin Ringleader with the mill cards and put them into your hand, essentially doing what Ringleader does, but going 1 card deeper. So I think that Grub's command, 5 mana is a lot. If this card was an instant, I would be very excited for this card. As a sorcery, I think it still might be good enough for Goblins for a couple of reasons. So one of the reasons is Goblins are pretty good at tutoring up other Goblins. You have Goblin Matron, you got Boggart Harbinger, both see play in Modern Goblins. You got Goblin Recruiter, so good it's banned in a lot of formats. Mogcatcher if you're playing Commander. And because this is a Kindred sorcery, it counts as a Goblin. So when Goblin Matron says, search your library for a Goblin, Grub's command actually counts. So I could see this being like a sneaky one of that you play in a Goblin deck, even in a format like Modern, and most of the time you don't draw it, but then when you really do want it, you can always Matron it into your hand and kill something, or generate card advantage, or copy your Goblin Matron and do it all again the next turn. So I think the fact that it's so easy to tutor up probably means this card is pretty good in Goblins. As far as Standard's concerned, I mean, the card seems pretty strong. I don't know if Goblins is going to be good enough, but we do have pieces, as we talked about before, to build a Standard Goblin deck. And if we do have Goblins in Standard, I could see playing a copy or 2. Again, 5 mana is just so much, but 5 mana to like kill your best thing and mill 5 cards, get 2 or 3 Goblins in my hand, that is actually a lot of value. That's where being an instant would be so nice. If you could like cast this on your opponent's end step, kill something, mill the cards, get your Goblins, play them during the next turn, then I think the card would be really, really strong. But even as a sorcery, I think it's got a chance to see play in Standard Goblins if they develop. In Commander, pretty much the same thing as the Merfolk card we were just talking about. Very good in Commander Goblins. I mean, you get removal, copying your stuff's good, being able to haste up your team is strong, generating card advantage is good, but a lot of Goblin decks are in Rakdos. So if you're Rakdos Goblins like Grenzo or Wart, then I think this card is worth considering. But if you're Mono Red Goblins, obviously can't play it because of color identity issues. We also got a card that I think gets the record for being the wordiest card that actually has the least amount of effect in a game of Magic, in Trystan Callous Cultivator / Trystan Permanent Color. So the front side of this card, a 3-mana 3/4 legendary creature elf druid. It has Death Touch. It says when this creature enters or transforms into Trystan, mill 3 cards. Then if there's an elf card in your graveyard, you gain 2 life. At the beginning of your first main phase, you can pay a black mana if you do transform into Trystan Pertinent Color, a 3-mana 3/4 with Death Touch that says, whenever this creature transforms into Trystan, mill 3 cards, then you may exile an elf card from your graveyard. If you do, each opponent loses 2 life. Then at the beginning of your first main phase, you can pay a grain to flip back into the front side of Trystan. So in all of those words, this card actually is pretty much just a 3/4 Death Toucher for 3. It's a 3/4 Death Toucher for 3 that reads like a book. Yes, I guess if you're in elf deck, you play this and you mill cards, and if there's elf in your graveyard, you gain a little life, then eventually you flip it and exile the elf and you drain your opponent a little bit. Still doesn't seem super worth it to me. I was shocked that there's not more to this card. It's not mill 3 cards and put something in your hand. Maybe they didn't have enough text to put that on there, but you're not like generating card advantage or anything. You're just straight up milling yourself, and then if there's elves in your graveyard, you get a tiny bit of value. So Trystan, I don't know why you would play this card. Honestly, I don't know what the milling has to do with elves. Like, we were talking about standard elves. Maybe we get some elf mill theme in the rest of Lorwyn that we haven't seen yet, and this makes sense. But I can't imagine playing this in my, like, Llanowar Elvish Archdruid elf deck. I guess you could try to play it in a graveyard deck, like Insidious Roots, or, like, to get cards in your graveyard to reanimate. But even then, I think there's probably better options. I guess a 3/4 Death Toucher is fine, but really, this card just has an insane amount of words on it, and actually does relatively little in an actual game of Magic. Next up, we get the return and also the death of Rhys, and Rhys the Evermore. So a 2-mana white legendary elf warrior. It's a 2/2 with flash. It says when it enters, another target creature you control gains persist until end of turn. So when it dies, if it had no -1/-1 counters on it, you return to the battlefield under its owner's control with a -1/-1 counter on it, and then you can pay a white and tap it to remove any number of counters from target creature you control only as a sorcery. So Rhys the Evermore, this card at its base level, it's removal protection, right? You have a creature that you care about, your opponent firebending lessons or shoots the sheriff, you flash and reef, you give that creature persist, you get it back with a -1/-1 counter on it, and then the next turn you could use Rhys to remove that counter, so then it is a little bit bigger, I guess, if that matters to you. It also is pretty cute with stuff that just enters with -1/-1 counters on it, just for that second mode. And right now, we don't really have a ton of stuff like this in Standard, so I'm using Belligerent Hatchling as an example of this 4-mana 6/6, but it enters with 4 -1/-1 counters. You could use Rhys to just remove them and get the 6/6 right away, but they leaked a bunch of cards from Lorwyn Eclipsed, and we're not going to talk about them. We're going to wait till everything's officially spoiled. But from the leaks, we have learned that there are some cards that work similarly to Belligerent Hatchling. They're going to enter with a bunch of -1/-1 counters, and then you remove those counters and your thing gets bigger. So Rhys might make a lot more sense once we see the rest of the official spoilers for the set. That last ability might actually be kind of exciting. So Rhys, it's a fine 2-drop. It can protect your stuff. It might have some shenanigans coming up. We also got a wild but expensive counter spell in Glen Elendra's Answer. So a 4-mana instant. It says this spell can't be countered. Target all spells your opponents control and all abilities your opponents control, and create a 1/1 blue and black fairy creature token with flying for each spell and ability countered this way. So Glen Elendra's Answer, and that showcase treatment looking super good. Glen Elendra's Answer, it's like an upgraded summary dismissal that's also an upgraded last word, but also works kind of like a disallow or a geist snatch because you get creatures out of it, and you can answer abilities along with answering spells on this deck. So Glen Elendra's Answer, in a lot of ways, it is the ultimate counter spell, right? It can't be countered. It counters literally all of your opponent's stuff. It counters none of your stuff, and you might even get a creature or two out of it. The only problem is it's 4 mana, and 4 mana is just so much to leave up. Like, if they printed literal Cryptic Command into Standard, I guess it would probably see some play, but I'm not even sure how busted Cryptic Command would be, because 4 mana is just so much to leave up for a counter spell. So Glen Elendra's Answer, really, really strong effect. I just don't know if it's going to see play anywhere. If you think about counters that we have in various formats, in Standard we got No More Lies, we got 3 steps ahead. In Modern you got Force of Negation. In Legacy you get Force of Will. In Vintage you get Force of Will. So 4 mana is just too much, even considering all the upside, to play in really any format. I thought for a minute, well, maybe this is like an answer to Storm decks, right? Because if you can counter all spells and abilities, if your opponent goes to Grape Shot you or whatever, you don't really care because you're going to get rid of the Storm ability and you're going to get rid of the Grape Shot, so you fizzle the entire thing. But you can already do the same thing essentially for free in older formats with Mind Break Trap or with Flusterstorm. So I thought, okay, maybe it's the creature. Maybe creature is the reason this card is good, because I'm going to get some fairies out of this, right? But really, most of the time, you're going to counter a thing, right? Like, I think a huge percentage of the time, your opponent casts a spell that you can't let resolve. You cast this, you counter it, you get a single fairy. That's not bad, but the dream of getting like 5 fairies or something, it's just going to be really unlikely that you end up with a stack like that. Probably your best chance of having a stack like that is going to be against something like the Landfall deck, where if they have like a Tifa, an Earthbender Ascension, and a Mightform Harmonizer, and then they play a land drop, they're going to get a bunch of triggers, and then Glen Answer can answer all of them and maybe make a whole bunch of fairies. So that is a cute upside. There's going to be situations where this actually is a powerful token producer, but I'm just not sure you can put a 4-mana counterspell in your deck. The absolute dream is you're up against like some Raise the Past deck with Snarling Gorehounds and Hinterland Sanctifiers, and your opponent's got a full graveyard, and they reanimate everything, and they just get this massive stack. You've seen it on Magic Arena, the stack of like 60 triggers, and then you Glen Elendra's Answer, you counter all the triggers, you get like 60 tokens, you win the game. If you could counter your own stuff with this, then you could kind of build around it like a combo piece almost, but since it only counters your opponent's stuff, you can't really do this yourself. You gotta trust that your opponent's doing the Raise the Past thing. So there are gonna be situations where this card will be absolutely busted, but the baseline of just 4-mana counter a spell, get a 1/1, I'm not sure it's good enough to actually show up in decks, especially right now when counter spells aren't a big part of the format. Being uncounterable is going to have the most value when other people are playing counter spells, because this guarantees that you get to win a counter war. And right now in Standard, we're just not a very counter heavy format. Yeah, there's some like sideboard counters. I guess it'll quench you out of the Lessons deck, but we're not an especially counter heavy format because Cavern of Souls is in the format. So I'm not sure this really lines up with the meta anyway. If things shift in the future and we end up in a meta that's all about control mirrors, then I think this card's worth keeping in mind. But for now, I think it's a super cool design. It is a potentially very powerful design. I'm just skeptical that at 4 mana, it's going to be fast enough to actually show up in any 60 card format. We also got Hexing Squelcher, a 2-mana 2/2 Goblin Sorcerer. And this card seems pretty good. It says, this spell can't be countered, and it has Ward of Pay 2 life. And then it says, spells you control can't be countered, and other creatures you control have Ward of Pay 2 life. You're probably thinking, why doesn't it just say creatures you control have Ward Pay 2 life? And I'm pretty sure Wizards does this to make sure people don't overlook the fact that its ability applies to itself as well. If you're a longtime Magic player, you're probably like, this would read way cleaner to me if it just said creatures you control have Ward Pay 2 life. But I think it's to help newer players understand what's actually going on. Make sure they know that Hexing Squelcher itself is affected by the ability. So Hexing Squelcher, this calls back to Vexing Susher from Shadowmoor, original Lorwyn block. And I gotta say, I absolutely love how many callbacks there are in this set. Earlier today, I did a short talking about cards that I thought could be reprinted in the set. And one of the things I said is, one thing Wizards has done more and more recently is not do straight up reprints, but do callbacks to older cards. And we have seen a ton of those. So many cards we've seen today are kind of like an updated 2026, almost 20-year later version of cards that we got on original Lorwyn block. And it's super cool to see. Also, kind of just a way better version of Spider-Punk, as if Spider-Man needed another card to come out and show just how bad that set really was. But if you're thinking about playing Spider-Punk, now you play Hexing Squelcher, which does basically the same stuff but better, and you don't have to deal with Spider-Punk if that's not your jam. So Hexing Squelcher, the upside of this card is it does a little bit of everything, right? It protects your creatures a little bit from removal by giving them Ward of Pay 2 life. It protects your stuff from being countered completely for as long as it's out, although how relevant that is right now in Standard, we're just talking about how we're not in a super counter-heavy meta, so I don't know how relevant that actually is. The downside of Hexing Squelcher is, if your opponent wants to kill your stuff, they can't always just kill the Hexing Squelcher. Yes, they're going to have to take 2, which is nice, so even if your opponent just immediately kills it, you essentially got a shock out of it. You got 2 damage in on your opponent for playing a 2-drop. Not insane, but at least it's something. And if it does stick around, it's going to be painful for your opponent to target your other stuff. So it's not like the be-all and end-all, because it does just die to removal, but it is nice to have the option. The question is, how relevant is making your stuff uncounterable? And the answer is it really depends on your deck. If you're just playing goblins, I don't think you really need to make your stuff uncounterable. You got Cavern of Souls already, so I'm not sure you really need Hexing Squelcher. On the other hand, if you're playing a Doppelgang deck, and your whole plan is, I have to resolve this Doppelgang, I've been playing Sphinx of the Last Word to make sure my Doppelgang doesn't get countered, because so many people bring in negates from the sideboard. And I think Hexing Squelcher just kind of does the same thing, but way more efficiently. play. So that mode is really going to depend on the deck that you're playing. As I said before, there are counters in Standard. They're just not super heavily played. So this might be another card where you kind of wait and see how the meta shakes out in the future. In older formats, I could see playing this card. It does work in like Legacy Goblins or Modern Goblins, but those decks also have Cavern of Souls. You need this card. How many copies would you play? So I think it's of a power level where you could see this in Eternal Goblins, definitely in Commander Goblins, but it might be a little redundant with Cavern of Souls. The biggest exception, I think, is Muxus Goblin decks. Muxus Goblin decks are like the doppelgang decks of goblins in a weird way, where really all you're trying to do is resolve this one spell. And if you resolve this one spell, you're probably going to win the game. So if your goal is just to play a Muxus and trust that Muxus is going to win, then Hexing Squelcher seems amazing in your goblin deck, because you really want to make sure that Muxus isn't counterable, and then you get a little value out of the ward as well. In Commander, I think I would play this in most goblin decks, probably all goblin decks, honestly. In Commander, I mean, I play with Crim all the time. Crim's always got a million counter spells, so shutting down counters is nice. The ward, not going to save you from a wrath, but it might make people think twice before targeting your stuff. Maybe they don't want to take the 2 damage to do it, so it is a nice little bonus upside. So Hexing Squelcher, I love the callback. I love the art. I think this is one of the most efficient cards that we've seen in the set today. Not really sure how it lines up with the meta in Standard right now, but I do think this is a card that we'll see playing 60 card formats and in Commander as well. We also got Disruptor of Currents, a 5-mana 3/3 Merfolk wizard with Flash and Convoke, so we can tap our creatures to help pay for it. And then it says, when this creature enters, return up to 1 target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. So Disruptor of Currents kind of reminds me of Jill with Flash. If you want the high upside comparison, maybe a Brazen Borrower almost. Disruptor of Currents, though, it really depends on the Convoke, I think. If 5 mana, this card is not very good. But if you're playing some sort of go-wide Merfolk deck, and you can Convoke this for free, or for like 2 mana or 1 mana, then it's pretty good. Like a 1 mana 3/3 that bounces your opponent's best thing at instant speed is actually a very strong card. So I think Merfolk staple potentially if Merfolk are a deck in Standard. And I could also see playing this in just some sort of go-wide blue deck. If I'm getting enough bodies on the battlefield, maybe a Flash style deck, I think this card could be worth it there as well. But if you don't have a bunch of bodies and you don't have any creature type synergies, then Disruptor Currents probably doesn't quite make the cut. Good limited card at least. We also got a new weird wrath in Winnowing. So Winnowing, 6 mana white sorcery. It has Convoke, so we can tap our creatures to help pay for it. It says for each player, you choose a creature that player controls. Then each player sacrifices all other creatures they control that don't share a creature type with the chosen creature they control. The wording is a little bit weird, but essentially, you cast this, you choose a creature for each player. Everything that's not that creature type that that player controls gets blown up. So Winnowing, I think this card's actually kind of insane in Commander. If you're playing a tribal deck where all your creatures are the same type, this card is essentially a Kindred Dominance, where you choose a creature of whatever type your deck is built around. Your opponents may or may not be playing tribal decks, probably not. So this is often going to be close to, not a hard wrath, because your opponent's always going to have 1 creature left over, but you can probably blow up all except one of your opponent's creatures, and you can probably lose essentially 0, and maybe literally 0 of your creatures. And because of Convoke, you can be casting this potentially for free or for a very low amount of mana. So if your deck is built around 1 creature type, and I don't even care what that creature type is, you can be angels with Lyra, or humans with Kyler, or cats with Arabo. I think this would be in my deck in Commander. I think this is that tier level of wrath for the format, thanks to Convoke, and thanks to the fact that if you're a tribal deck, it's a one-sided wrath. Even if it leaves 1 creature for each opponent, like, you don't lose anything when you're casting this in a tribal deck. So in a tribal deck in Commander, I would play this essentially every single time. Outside of tribal decks, and outside of Commander, that's where I'm a little skeptical. If there was a tribal deck, if there was Angel Tribal, or, I don't know, I guess Heir Apparent. If Heir Apparent becomes S tier in Standard, this card could be worth considering there. But we just don't really have tribal decks in Standard right now. Maybe that changes with Lorwyn Eclipsed. We'll have to wait and see. But unless you have a whole bunch of creatures of the same creature type, in Standard, Day of Judgment or Ultima, just going to be a better way to get the job done. So Winnowing, awesome Commander wrath for tribal decks. In Standard, we'll have to see if tribal decks become a thing. Next up, we get a red 4-drop that you should probably only play if you want the game to end really quickly, and you don't really care who ends the game, in Lavaleaper. So a 4-mana 4/4 elemental. It says all creatures have haste. Not sure why this doesn't say Lavaleaper has haste, and then all other creatures have haste. I don't know how Wizards chooses their formatting on stuff like this, but all creatures, including itself, has haste. And then whenever a player taps a basic land for mana, that player adds 1 mana of any type that land could produce. So essentially, all creatures have haste, all basic lands tap for double mana. So this is going to speed the game up a lot. If you think about what this card is, it's Mass Hysteria mixed with Gauntlet of Power, essentially. And I just don't really think that you can play this card outside of decks that are built around Chaos or Group Hug or Group Slug. But it's hard for me to imagine in a competitive 1v1 format you can play this card. Because the problem with a card like this is you play it for 4 mana, then your opponent untaps and they get all their mana first, maybe double mana, thanks to your Lavaleaper, and then all their creatures that they play with their double mana have haste, and then they probably just kill you. It's a reward for playing your Lavaleaper. If I was going to try to build around this in a 60 card format, step 1 is play all basic lands. So you make sure that every land that you play, or very close to it, is going to be double mana with Lavaleaper. And then you cross your fingers and hope that your opponent's playing like a 3-color deck with almost no basics. And then you kind of get around the drawback of that last mode being symmetrical, or at least it's going to benefit you way more than your opponents. So I think that's one of the nice things. It also kind of works pretty well with Badger Molcub. Like, can you imagine how much mana you would make if all of your creatures tap for double mana, and then your basic lands can be turned into creatures thanks to Earthbending? You're just going to make a ridiculous amount of mana, and you might even be able to like combo off because you can play things with haste to make even more mana. So I am kind of curious if I can build a Badger Molcub Lavaleaper combo deck. I don't think it'll be competitive, but it would be interesting. So Lavaleaper, play it in a Chaos Commander deck, I would say. Play it in the last game of the night when you just want to make sure the game doesn't go for 3 hours and you want to make sure that someone's going to die so you can go home. Don't play it because you're expecting to rank up to Mythic and Standard, though. We also got Mornsong Aria. Speaking of sweet callbacks and spectacular art, a 3-mana enchantment that says players can't draw cards or gain life. In the beginning of each player's draw step, that player loses 3 life, searches their library for a card, puts it in their hand, and then shuffles. So if this sounds familiar, it's essentially Marlin of the Mornsong, an infamous old Morningtide elf wizard that essentially had the same ability, but it was on a creature. And Marlin was essentially unplayable. The problem with Marlin is you play Marlin, no one can draw cards. Everyone tutors once on their draw step. So you play Marlin, then you pass to your opponent, and your opponent's like, I get to tutor now. I guess I'll just tutor up a removal spell and kill the Marlin. And then essentially you did nothing except spend mana on a Marlin. And it could be even worse than that. Your opponent might be like, all right, you know what? I'll just tutor up my combo piece and win the game. You can keep your Marlin. I will just kill you right now. So Mornsong kind of has that same issue for the most part. It's still like a super cool callback, and it's definitely a super sweet against the odds card. So how can you build around this card? And the answer is you want to stop your opponent from searching their library. So the easiest way to do this, Opposition Agent, which just makes it so you control your opponent while they're searching their library, and then you get the card too. So if you can get out a Mornsong Aria and then Opposition Agent, you essentially make it so your opponents can't draw cards for the rest of the game, and you get to tutor from their deck on each of their draw steps, which is kind of absurd. Also pretty good with like Even Mind Sensor, makes it so your opponent can only search their top 4 cards instead of their own deck. If you want to just make nobody draw cards, you can Mindlock Orb, so no one can search their libraries. That would also affect you, so you would need some sort of plan for winning the game through not being able to draw cards for the rest of the game. But those are the kind of things you're looking for with Mornsong Aria. Outside of those shenanigans, I think it's the same as Marlin, where if you play this and your opponent gets the first tutor out of it, they're either going to tutor up an answer to the Mornsong Aria, or they're just like, hey, thanks, I really needed my Monument of Endurance. I'm just going to tutor it up, and I'll just kill you before you ever get to tutor. So I don't think you can play this card fairly, but it is a really intriguing brew around, and the art is super spectacular, and it's super flavorful and nostalgic. We also got Abigale, the Elegant First Year, a double Orzhov hybrid 1/1 bird bard. It has flying, first strike, and lifelink, and it says when it enters, up to 1 other target creature loses all abilities, and then you put a flying counter, a first strike counter, and a lifelink counter on that creature. So Abigale this card is kind of wild. So the upside is you play this for 2 mana and you can make something lose all abilities. The downside is you give that something Flying Lifelink in first strike. We've never really seen a card like this before. So if first glance you would think, okay, I can play this like a removal spell. So my opponent has like an Ice Till Explorer and I really don't want to pop off with its abilities. So I Abigale, I make Ice Till Explorer lose all of its abilities. That's kind of fine. The downside is your opponent still has an Ice Till Explorer, and now it's a 2/4 flying first strike lifelinker. That gets even worse if it's a Mightform Harmonizer, which is a 4/4, a Sunspine Lynx, which is a 5/4. Yes, you get rid of the abilities, but you're giving your opponent this massive flying lifelinker that's just gonna beat you down and gain a ton of life. So I don't think this works that well as removal in general. I think what this actually is a weird combo piece where you're trying to use this on your own creatures. Like, imagine you somehow lose enough life to get a Death Shadow on the battlefield, and then you can play Abigale, make Death Shadow lose all of its abilities, and all of a sudden you got a 13/13 flying first striking lifelinker for 1 mana. In Standard, we have the Ancient one, a 2 mana 8/8, but you need to get 8 permanents in your graveyard before it can attack or block. With Abigale, you can play Ancient 1 on turn 2, turn 3 Abigale, make it lose all of its abilities, and suddenly you have an 8/8 flying first striking lifelinker smashing your opponent on turn 3. Or Lupin Prototype, another iconic against the odds card. Can't attack or block unless the player has no cards in hand. Abigale gets rid of that ability. So I think that's what you want to do with Abigale. I think you want to play Abigale with these cards that are really overstated, but really hard to use because of their drawback, and use Abigale to get rid of their drawback. I did want to mention, it doesn't work the way you want it to with some things. Quantum Riddler, let's say. If you warp a Quantum Riddler, and then you Abigale to make the Quantum Riddler lose all of its abilities, that warp ability is this weird delayed trigger that's still going to happen. So even though your Quantum Riddler won't have any abilities, it's still going to go to exile on your end step. Or Earthbent lands. If you Abigale an Earthbent land, yes, it loses its ability, but when that land dies, the delayed Earthbend trigger is still going to put the land back into play. So a couple little things to keep in mind there. In Commander, I could see a deck around blinking this a bunch of times, kind of like Orzhov Deadpool almost, where you just Abigale and you try to make all of the creatures on the battlefield, your opponent's commanders first, and then everything else as well, lose all of their abilities. Sure, your opponent's got a bunch of these like flying lifelinkers running around, but their deck's just not going to function, which is exactly what Deadpool does. So if you're a fan of the Deadpool playstyle of just making everyone really mad at you because their deck doesn't work, Abigale can do that for just 2 mana essentially. So Abigale, this card's way cooler than it looks. It looks like a bad removal spell, but it's actually this super unique synergy piece, and I am super excited to brew around it. We also got Kinbinding, a 5 mana enchantment that says, creatures you control get +X/+X, where X is the number of creatures that entered the battlefield under your control this turn, and at the beginning of your turn, create a 1/1 green and white Kithkin creature token, beginning of combat on your turn. So you're always going to have at least 1 creature enter, which means when you go to combat, your stuff's going to get at least +1/+1. However, if you have a whole bunch of creatures enter, your creatures can get really, really huge from this card. So Kinbinding, it's essentially a worse but easier to track Cathar's Crusade. So if you're someone who wants to play Cathar's Crusade in your commander deck, but don't want to deal with the endless amount of dice it requires to actually track Cathar's Crusade, Kinbinding is going to probably be good enough to work as your finisher, but also be way easier to track, because all you need to care about is how many creatures entered the battlefield during that one specific turn, and not keeping dice going up for every creature that enters for the entire game. So bad Cathar's Crusade, but easier to track Cathar's Crusade. It works really well with things that put a lot of bodies into play, obviously. Like if you secure the waste and make 10 1/1 tokens, all your things are going to get +10/+10. If you pop off with Scoot Swarm and make 20 Scoot Swarms, all your stuff's going to get +20/+20. So in Commander, especially in some sort of token deck, I think this is actually a pretty legit finisher. So Kinbinding, at 5 mana, it's way too slow for 2026 Standard. There is just no way. But in Commander, if you're playing a token deck and want to do something like your Cathar's Crusade, I think this gets the job done pretty well. Speaking of cards that are just too slow for Standard, we also got Golaith Daydreamer, a 4 mana 4/4. This says, whenever you get to insert a sorcery spell from your hand, exile that card with a dream counter on it, instead of putting it in the graveyard as it resolves. And then whenever this creature attacks, you may cast a spell from among the cards you own and exile with dream counters on them without paying its mana cost. So Goliath Daydreamer, It seems fun in a commander deck, right? You can play this, you cast a spell, it exiles it, then you attack with it, you cast that spell again for free. It is some sweet value. As far as standard's concerned, though, I just can't see this card working. You need to play it for 4 mana as a 4 mana 4/4 pseudo vanilla. So you need to play it for 4 mana, then you need to use more mana somehow to cast a spell that you care about, and then you need Golaith Daydreamer to live for a turn, and then you need to be able to attack with a 4/4, and your reward is you essentially get to rebound that spell. You get to cast the spell again for free. So I think Goliath Daydreamer, the design is cool. I could see messing around with it in Commander, but it just seems a little bit too slow and clunky for 60 card formats. We also got a super cool, but kind of overcosted card in Mirrormind Crown, a 4-mana equipment. This says as long as this equipment is attached to a creature, the first time you would create 1 or more tokens each turn, you may instead create that many tokens that are copies of equipped creature, and you can equip it for 2. So if this sounds familiar, this is quite literally Edge of Eternity's Moonlit Meditation, with the downside that it technically costs 6 mana to get going instead of 3, but the upside, which is that it solves one of Moonlit Meditation's biggest problems, that if the creature that you put it on dies, you can always just move it over to another creature and try again. But same exact wording as Moonlit Meditation. And Moonlit Meditation and now Mirrormind Crown can do some wild things. We played Moonlit Meditation with Heir Apparent, and you make all of your Heir Apparent tokens enter as copies of Heir Apparent, so then they make tokens, and it's very easy to play a single Heir Apparent once you get going and make like just hundreds of power and hundreds of tokens. So you can do super wild things with this card. I think that's probably the direction I would go with it in Standard. You could also like get it on a creature and then United Battlefront to make a ton of tokens, but have all those tokens enter as Overlord of the Boiler Biggles that you have the Mirrormind Crown on and burn your opponent out of the game. So there's certainly synergies here, but I think this is really more of a commander card than a standard card. Moonlight Meditation is already like a little bit slow and clunky and risky. And Mirrormind Crown is just so much more mana. I can't imagine playing a 4-mana equipment and 2 to get on a creature and having that creature not die in Standard. But in Commander, imagine putting this on an Avenger of Zendikar and then casting a Storm Herd to make like 30 Pegasus tokens. But those 30 Pegasus tokens are actually going to be 30 Avenger of Zendikars. Each of them are going to make a 0/1 green plant for each land that you control. So you're just going to end up with literally hundreds of creatures on the battlefield. So this is a card that can do some really cool explosive things. It's just a little bit expensive for 60 card formats. Speaking of too slow for Standard, we also got Dawnshand Dissident, a 1-mana 1/2, and you're probably wondering, how can a 1-drop be too slow for Standard? Let me explain. A 1-mana 1/2 Elf Warlock. You can tap it and blight 1, so put a -1/-1 counter on one of your own creatures to surveil 1. You can tap it and blight 2 to exile a card from a graveyard, and then during your turn you can cast creature spells from among the cards you own and exiled with this creature by removing 3 counters from among creatures you control in addition to paying their other costs. So Dawnshand Dissident, its ability kind of reminds me a little bit of a Stalemancer's Adept. Intrepid Paleontologist is this cheap creature that lets you play creatures from your graveyard. My big concern for this one, though, is blighting, especially blighting 2, means you're going to need a lot of toughness on the battlefield, or you're just going to be killing your own creatures. I'm not sure how many times you can realistically be putting 2 -1/-1 counters on your own creatures without them dying. And even though you can use its last mode, removing the counters from those creatures to cast things from your graveyard, I feel like it's just going to be kind of fragile and difficult to set up. I'm sure there are situations where you got a big board going and this card's going to be absolutely bonkers, but this is a 1-drop that's going to be at its best like on turn 5 rather than on turn 1. So that's why I feel like the card's kind of slow. If this card does work in Standard, I think it might be at its best in the Insidious Roots deck, actually. It is kind of competing with a Stalemancer's Adept, but I think it could definitely have a home there. It fills the graveyard, it exiles cards from your graveyard to trigger Insidious Roots. If one of your important synergy pieces dies, you can always get it back using its ability. The other thing you can do with this card is every time we get a card with a finality counter on it, there's going to be someone's like, oh, that's pretty cool, but that's got a finality counter. If only I had a Solemnity on the battlefield, because I don't want to deal with finality counters. Well, Dawnshand Dissident, it is a way to remove finality counters from your creatures. It can remove any counters from your creatures. So imagine like Esper Origins, casting the backside of Esper Origins, and then using Dawnshand Dissident to remove the finality counter. So when you get to the last mode of your saga, it just goes to the graveyard, and then you can do it again, and then you can do it again, and just infinite Esper Origins actually actually seems pretty sweet. So the fact that this can remove finality counters from stuff in Standard makes it kind of unique. So even though I think the card is probably not a 1-drop you're just going to play in most decks, there's certainly some cool tricks and uses for this card. So Dawnshand Dissident, I don't think it's a staple level card. It does feel kind of slow, but it also does some pretty neat things. We also got Bre of Clan Stoutarm, a 4-mana 4/4 Boros Giant Warrior. It's a legendary creature. You can pay 1 and a white to make another target creature you control gain flying and lifelink until end of turn. And that says at the beginning of your end step, if you gained life this turn, exile cards from the top of your library until you exile a non-land card. You can cast that card without paying its mana cost if the spell's mana value is less than or equal to the amount of life you gain this turn. Otherwise, you put it in your hand. So Bre calls back to Brian Stoutarm. I'm not sure if they're like, I don't know, a couple? Brother and sister, just part of the same clan, but calls back to Brian Stoutarm, which kind of had a similar ability. Brian Stoutarm, you could sack a creature to deal damage equal to its power to target player. The flying ability is kind of similar, right? You can just send the creature to the air, smash in for damage. You don't even have to sacrifice it, and you can swing in for damage each turn. So I think that Bre, cool callback to Brian Stoutarm. The other thing I love about this card is it's like a Boros life gain commander. When I think of Boros in Commander, I mostly think of equipment decks, and it's really cool to see the color combination doing something a little bit different. As far as Standard's concerned, I mean, you play in a life gain deck, Hinterland Sanctifier, Case of an Eaten Feast, Essence Channeler, we have pieces for a life gain deck. Again, this one just seems kind of slow. I think this is another card that was designed to be a spicy commander, not designed to be a standard staple, but you could play it in the 4-drop slot of a life gain deck and just use its last ability to try to generate card advantage. If you can stack up enough Case of an Eaten Feast and Hinterland Sanctifiers, you can be gaining, 5-6 life each turn, and then you just get a free card on your end step every single turn. That's kind of a sweet ability. The downside is it just kind of dies or gets bounced by everything. So you play this and your opponent can just Firebending Lesson or Boomerang Basics or Bitter Triumph, and at 4 mana it's going to be tough to replay a bunch of times. Where this card excites me though is in Commander, because in Commander, Boros life gain isn't really a thing. I guess you got Ragast is like kind of life gainy, Firesong and Sunspeaker also like kind of life gainy, but I think this is the most obvious Boros life gain commander. So if you want to build a Boros deck, but you don't want to just stack up a bunch of equipment on a creature, this is a really fun card to build around. You just play a bunch of Soul Sisters, you play Beacon of Immortality, gain huge amounts of life, and then you just get to spin into things for free and start casting them on your end step. So I think Bre, super cool commander, a fun like casual standard card, but probably a little bit slow at 4 mana. But I don't really care if it's good in standard, because I just love that we're getting Boros commanders that are doing something other than putting equipment in play. Rounding things out today with some bonus cards and lower rarity stuff, and I promise I'm going to try to keep it quick, because this is already going to be the longest spoiler video that I've ever made. But we get a ton of special guests from the set, and I gotta say Wizards nailed it with these cards. The special guests, they look great. They're mostly cards from original Lorwyn block. They hit pretty much all the most expensive cards from original Lorwyn block at Dolmen's Gate, Bitter Blossom, Peter Servant. So it's really everything I could want out of this special guest from Lorwyn Eclipsed. Like, the aesthetic's good, the value's good, the cards are good. These cards are not standard legal, although we are going to get like Helix Pinnacle on Magic Arena for the first time, which is going to be super fun. We also got a couple of the face commanders officially spoiled. Not going to get into them here. I'm sure Tomer's going to make some content about them, but you can check them out over on mtgpreviews.com. We also got the basic lands from the set, and I gotta say I love how they did this, because they took each basic land and they made a Shadowmoor version, which is kind of the dark gloomy version, but then also they took the same setup and made the Lorwyn version, which is the light happy shiny version, and it just really captures what Lorwyn Eclipsed and what Lorwyn and Shadowmoor are really all about. So super good looking basic lands. As far as lower rarity cards, just a few worth shouting out. Chomping Changeling, 3 mana 1/2 shapeshifter, so all creature types. When it enters, destroy up to 1 target artifact or enchantment. This is essentially Reclamation Sage. Reclamation Sage, a staple of elf decks, but Chomping Changeling, it's a Reclamation Sage of every creature type. So no matter what creature type you're built around, this is going to give you a Reclamation Sage, and I'm excited to see how push some of these Changelings look. They actually look very, very strong compared to past Changelings. We also got Boggart Mischief, a 3-mana Goblin Kindred enchantment. It says when it enters, you may blight one. If you do, you create 2 1/1 red and black goblin creature tokens. So you got to put a -1/-1 counter on one of your creatures. If you do, you get a couple goblins. And then when a goblin creature you control dies, each opponent loses a life and you gain a life. So Boggart Mischief, it calls back to Boggart Shenanigans. This is essentially the updated version of Boggart Shenanigans. You get to gain some life along the way rather than dealing damage. Maybe make some tokens if you get to do some blighting. And if there's some sort of sacrificey, blighty goblin aristocrat deck, I think that Boggart Mischief might actually be playable in Standard. We also got the return of Spell Snare, which is a massive reprint. Just 1 mana, counter target spell with mana value of 2. And Spell Snare, this is a staple all the way back to like Legacy and Modern. Just a very, very good counter spell. If you think about the power of this card, it's not just that there's a lot of good 2-drops, and there are a lot of good 2-drops. This is 1 mana counter, negate Badger Molekov, Esper Origins, Deep Cavern Bat, Iroh's Demonstration, Shoot the Sheriff, Keen-Eyed Curator, a huge list of very playable Standard cards. But the real power of this card, if you've never played with Spell Snare, is it's a 1 mana way that if you are on the draw, you can counter your opponent's 2-drop. So if you low roll and you're on the draw, and I wouldn't be surprised if this is part of the reason why Wizards brought it into Standard, but if you've ever played Standard and you lose the die roll and your opponent goes land and you go land and then your opponent goes land Badger Molekub or land Deep Cavern Bat, you feel like you're so far behind. But in that scenario, Spell Snare is 1 mana using your 1 available land from turn 1 to answer the Badger Molekub or the Deep Cavern Bat, which is absolutely huge. So this card, I think, will see play in Standard, also new to Pioneer for the first time, arguably even more important there because the meta is so broken and tilted towards aggro and Corey Steelcutter, and the Lessons package should trigger Prowess, but there's a lot of good 2-drops there as well. So I think this card, huge Standard implications, huge Magic Arena implications, huge Pioneer implications. So all around, most important reprint from the entire set. We also got a card which I think is kind of bonkers in Virulent Emissary, a 1 mana 1/1 elf assassin with Death Touch. This is when another creature you control enters, you gain a life. That is right. We have a Soul Warden now that is also a 1 mana 1/1 Death Toucher, which is wild because typically the power of Soul Wardens is they gain a ton of life, but the cost of a Soul Warden is you get a really bad body out of it. But Virulent Emissary, it gives you a Dragon Sniper. Well, you miss the reach, but really like a pseudo Dragon Sniper, a Tiny Bones. Death Touch means this can be taking down the biggest, baddest creatures in the entire format, while also solving the Soul Warden role. So I think that Virulent Emissary is just a wild card. I think this card should be a Commander staple. I think you can see Standard play. The card is way more nuts than you probably think it is. Like, I honestly think this is one of the strongest cards spoiled today, and it's just a random uncommon, but that's how high I am on Virulent Emissary. We also got a solid removal spell in Seer. 2 mana instant speed, 4 damage to a creature or planeswalker. This is Iroh's Demonstration, but you give up the lesson text, and you give up the ability to deal 1 damage to everything to gain instant speed and the abilities to hit planeswalkers, which might be more relevant now that we got Oko running around again. Finally today, we get some Draft Chef commons and uncommons that you can check out over at mtgpreviews.com. Anyway, that brings us to the end of day 1 of Lorwyn Eclipsed spoilers, and what a day it was. I'm pretty sure this is the longest, biggest spoiler day that we've ever had, and I gotta say, I am loving what I'm seeing from Lorwyn. This is literally exactly what I wanted out of this set. There's a ton of callbacks. The art is spectacular and it feels like Lorwyn. The cards look powerful. There's some really interesting stuff to brew around. But I want to know what you think. Now that we're a day in to Lorwyn Eclipsed spoilers, what do you think of the set? What do you think of the cards? What out of this huge list of cards from day 1 are you most excited to brew around? Let me know in the comments, and I'll be back tomorrow to talk even more Lorwyn Eclipsed spoilers. So until then, have an amazing day, everyone, and I will talk to you soon. Looking for more Magic? Well, you can find last week's Against the Odds here, or maybe check out some sweet pre-modern action.